And today at Ask Some Praxis, we're going to talk about getting started with the Power Platform. And if I hit that key, this is our team. And I was going to put a little moving van over Mike's head, but it seems rude.
You don't go ahead. That's fine.
And like I said, I don't know where Julie is, but we all come at these different topics from different perspectives because we do different work, though we often work together and overlap a bit. So we'll each bring our own perspectives to the discussion about the Power Platform today. And really what we want to talk about is getting started. We're not going to get deep into the mechanics of much of anything, though we're happy to take questions. We have a half an hour, so we're not going to be talking about whether you should use a custom card or an out-of-the-box card in your Power App. It's just not going to get that far. If you haven't, oh, there's Julie. Hi, Julie. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, sorry, nobody reminded me. I got back behind.
That's all right. I started the recording already, so we're good.
Awesome.
So we're going to talk about which components make up the Power Platform, or at least the ones we've chosen to talk about, some lessons that we've learned in the work that we do at SimPraxis, and some resources for you to get started. I thought it would be a good thing just to sort of give a little perspective on where we're coming from, so that there's some framing that might help you if you haven't used the Power Platform, or if you're still coming from an on-prem version of SharePoint. So in the old world, we had InfoPath, we had SharePoint Designer workflows, and those things really centered around SharePoint. SharePoint was at the core of what we did, and InfoPath could work with other data sources and stuff, but if you worked in the SharePoint world, all we really cared about was SharePoint lists. And then we had SQL Server Reporting Services, SSRS, as one of our options to do some reporting on the data that we would have collected, from InfoPath forms or regular SharePoint lists, maybe some customization and some workflow with SharePoint designers, and then some reporting with SQL Server reporting services. Today, someone else can talk about this one. Or I can keep going.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add is the last slide could have been even more complicated because we had two workflow services that were wedging in depending on how you wanted to do workflows.
That's true. From an end user perspective, not necessarily anything visible, but definitely two different generations of services.
Yeah. And I bring that up because part of that migration was with SharePoint 2010, we had the workflow engine that was built into SharePoint, that was written by SharePoint for SharePoint, like Mark said. But then in SharePoint 2013, behind the scenes, the SharePoint team was like, we got a lot of things that we want to do to SharePoint, and we got people working on this workflow thing, but we got these people across the hall that are doing a workflow thing. Let's just use that. And that was one of the first signs of what we see here, where the compartmentalization of these different features so that different products can take advantage of them. It's not just SharePoint that can use workflows now. SharePoint, 2013 used a workflow engine that was separate, the workflow manager. And now we're seeing, 10 years later, we're seeing that exploded out. So we kind of got to watch that grow.
Yep. And so if we want to talk a little bit about this slide, this is sort of our new, the new model here. With the Power Platform, and it's designed to be part workflow engine, part data visualization, and part low code, no code solution. And so that's where you sort of see the different components here. You have Power Apps, you have Power BI, and Power Automate. And it's also meant to be independent of SharePoint. So where InfoPath, you really did rely very heavily on the SharePoint data stores or SharePoint infrastructure to host them and fill them out. These you can actually connect to many different sources, whether it's part of the Microsoft 365 ecosystem or outside of it. So you can connect to SAP, you can connect to Jira, you can connect to MailChimp for all that it matters. There just needs to be a connector there. And there's also extensibility points in all of these that let you add on and bolt on your own stuff.
And that was a real shift for Microsoft to become sort of platform agnostic. We've seen that happen over the last 5 or 6 years, I suppose, where What do you mean? You have a connector to your competitor? That was sort of a shocker to start with, but all of these apps and services are built that way, is to be part of the landscape that you can use and not have a barrier between different technologies.
Yeah, and for those of us that have been working with Microsoft for a while, you're right. That was a huge shift. I mean, we can all remember the time when Steve Ballmer was making fun of Microsoft employees because they had iPhones, and all the trouble with PDFs in SharePoint because Microsoft didn't like Adobe. So seeing this is very different. I think part of it was change in leadership and a change in how things worked. But part of it was there were already other services offering this, so I think of things like IFTT, if this, then that, Zapier, and all of those that were already going to do this. So if Microsoft didn't do Flow or Power Automate and add all these connectors, then somebody was just going to use a different service that connected to Microsoft stuff, and that revenue would go someplace else. So I think they kind of got forced into it.
Yeah, and I mean, not for nothing, but the connectors to get to external services are all premium connectors. So you have to pay Microsoft a fee to use those connectors to get to outside services, where thus far, let's say it that way, thus far, the connectors to get to data inside of Microsoft 365 are mostly not premium, although there's a few caveats there. So, that I don't agree with, but who cares what I think?
I care, Julie.
Oh, deeply.
I do a little bit. It
no, you don't. Don't lie.
I got to work on that.
All right, so Power Apps is sort of the first one of those tools that we want to talk about, and it really is the successor to InfoPath. There was a funeral for InfoPath at the SharePoint conference back in like 1868, and it's still alive, and people are still using it.
That. It's in the notes. That was the year.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very premature funeral. There's still a lot of applications running out there that are on InfoPath. People are migrating InfoPath into Microsoft 365, which is not a great idea, but it's possible. So this is really where you want to be building things that feel like forms these days. It's a forms tool set, and it's supposed to be a low-code tool set, which we can all debate for hours on end, but it also is a business process front end. You can build a lot of your business logic into what we think of as forms, as long as that logic is sort of taking place while you're filling out the form and while you're adding the data. You can also fire off Power Automate flows from a Power App. So some of this is getting a little fuzzier about where the boundaries are. You can sort of reach into the other apps and services and ask them to do something for you while you're building out your Power App. And like we were talking about on the previous slide, there are connectors to almost anything that you can think of. The important thing here is SharePoint is a sort of a no-brainer connector. So are most of the other data sources inside Microsoft 365, like OneDrive, Excel, Outlook. Dataverse for Teams is a relatively new one. It's bringing some of what used to be called the Common Data Service and is now called Dataverse into the Teams environment and letting you build Power Apps that sit in Teams and reach out into the Common Data Service / Dataverse world as well. So it, again, very interoperable, very, at least to get started, quite simple to do things like customizing a list form by just pushing a couple of buttons and then moving some fields around on the screen. When you want to get into more complex logic, of course, it gets to be more complex. So you have to think about some of the things that you would want to do in a sort of better practices as you're building an actual application. If you were coding it, you want to start thinking about some of those things when you're building a good Power App that's more complicated as well.
Yeah, one thing I want to jump into there is one of the good piece of advice I hear folks get when they're looking into Power Apps is we all know it's a forms thing, but don't think of them as forms. InfoPath, very much when people made InfoPath forms, they made it look like a piece of paper. And with Power Apps, depending on what your mindset is, you're tempted to do that same thing. But Mark mentioned it's really a process front end. If it's possible, work out of that whole paper-based, replicating your form in Power Apps, and think about flow and using, like, those examples down there are great because they've got the big icons because they're being used on a phone. Think about dials if you're doing time instead of typing it in. we all know what forms means, but try real hard not to think of it as a form.
Yeah. I mean, I think the whole mobile first applies very clearly to the almost everything in the Power Platform. So you see those apps that are on those little phones down there. They're definitely meant to be hit with your finger as opposed to clicked on with a mouse. That's the starting point, unless you decide you want to use a different form factor and have it be more of a desktop kind of app.
Hey, Mark, what are some examples of some Power Apps that we've done for clients that, sort of at a generic high level?
Sure.
Just to give folks an idea.
We've done things like taking orders for stores, like to move product inside an organization. I want this and that and the other thing, and I want you to ship it to me next Wednesday. We've done customer feedback, which we'll talk a little bit about. You get feedback from your customer base, and you want to track that and act on it. We've done activity management inside a manufacturing facility. So, moving product from this location to this location to turn it into something else, and tracking how that works. I mean, really any business process that you can think of that you want to offer some automated support to can potentially fit into this. Sometimes a SharePoint list by itself is more than adequate for that. But if you want to build in lots of internal logic that, like if you make this selection, then these other things show up, that kind of stuff, then Power Apps is a natural progression that you would go to.
So the work we're doing for this is really a mini application. And I use mini in quotes, but it's an application. It's not a form process.
Yeah. That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, and sometimes with the list, with the new list formatting stuff, you can get a list if it's only one to kind of look a little like a form. So then, there's that tipping point where you need more than you can do in list formatting, and you kind of then head into Power Apps where you maybe have more than one list, or you need a more complicated user experience.
And you
especially. Emily and I have actually done this a couple of times where we've said, well, it should be a Power App, but wait a minute, we can do it with this, this sort of lighter form configuration stuff. I know, Em, you probably were just about to talk about that.
Yeah, the fact that we now have headers, footers, and body that we can edit with JSON. I used to use Power Apps just to hide a column in that new form, and now that I don't have to do that, and I can do that right in the SharePoint list, I found they become a lot more powerful when you are just making those simple forms, and Power Apps truly is becoming more of that application need.
And if the formatting doesn't work, the JSON formatting doesn't work, you can, what you and Mark were alluding to is, in addition to these sort of larger scale apps that you can build, you can also use Power Apps as a new way to edit the form for lists, to just sit on top of that. So just like we used to back in the old days, use InfoPath to customize the forms for lists, the edit, the view, you can do the same thing with Power Apps.
And hopefully one day soon you'll be able to do it with the SharePoint framework too. But
we hope so.
Feels like a pipe dream.
Yep.
But it's a big spectrum, right? It's anything from SharePoint list forms without touching them, and maybe some list formatting to turn it into an app-like experience, to customizing the list form in SharePoint, to using Power Apps to customize the list form, to building a full Power App. And in general, the further towards simplicity you stay, the faster you'll get a result, but you may be making some trade-offs for functionality. All right.
Cool. All right, so I'm going to talk about Power Automate. Power Automate or Flow, technically, it's more that workflow engine that we were talking about. In SharePoint 2010, 2007, we had the sort of light workflow engine that did approvals and so forth. Again, it was very SharePoint specific. Power Automate is really for any repeatable process that you want to kick off and have run on X different permutations. Some of the stuff that we're doing with this, we've built document approval workflows. We've built systems to just keep data in sync between two different lists. We've also built really robust site provisioning applications. So it really, you can do quite a bit. I think to Mark's point earlier about Power Apps, letting Power Apps be the front end of that data, and then letting Power Automate do the manipulation of the data or the moving or the massaging of the data, that's sort of using them all in parallel. There are a whole lot of native connectors to the Microsoft 365 ecosystem that let you touch any of the data that's in the system. So you can, work with Forms, you can work with Outlook, you can work with SharePoint, you can work with Lists, OneDrive. You can see all of them, and there are actually a whole bunch that are sort of third party. So if you look at the image on the right, you can access SQL, you can access Twitter, you can access To Do or Gmail. So it's a whole bunch of different stuff. And again, it's all sort of WYSIWYG, drag and drop. There's triggers that appear when how does something get kicked off, whether it's on a timer or whether it's when something is updated or whether or not it's, just sitting around as an HTTP hook. And then you have actions, and those actions do things. So you can create list items and all that. One thing that I know a lot of our clients have been sort of hesitant around is using a premium license. Anytime you hear Power Platform and the word premium, it sort of makes people shudder, because the licensing on the Power Platform is really confusing, and that's like a nice way to put it. With what?
You're so nice. That's a very nice way to put it.
Yeah.
Expletives would be more useful there.
Yeah.
So we do have an article in the Microsoft 365 community docs which can help with that, and I'm sure Emily is almost there to grab the link. So go ahead, sir.
But one of the things to really keep in mind is the HTTP action is your friend. I use the HTTP action to make REST calls for anything that's not a native connector. So you can use it to call other flows. You can use it to call an Azure function. You can actually use the HTTP, what's the word I want? You can use the HTTP trigger to actually provide an incoming webhook. We use a tool called Orchestry for some of our site provisioning, and when that is finished, it actually calls an HTTP trigger to then do stuff post provisioning. So that is a premium function, but the bar there of what you get that's premium is much better. The only other thing that I will say about Power Automate is that they can get kind of gnarly, especially if you're repeating code or actions across multiple flows. So I like to follow, because I'm a developer, I like to follow the practice of encapsulation. So I try to write one flow that uses the HTTP hook and that does one thing. So if I need to add a site to a hub, I write a flow called add site to hub, and it accepts parameters. And then if I need to access that, I actually call things. I use the HTTP action, and I actually call that and have it return data back. So investigate the HTTP action if you're not seeing what you need to do out of the box, because it is really a powerful tool.
Another thing that yes,
like
definitely.
knowing how to put together a REST call is a little
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, just like modifying JSON, right? You need to know the language. You need to know what you're trying to call and how to manipulate the data. Yeah. But it makes it a lot easier, and it opens the door wider.
Absolutely.
For instance, one of the things that just one of the little quirks is there's an action to add a site to a hub, which is great, but that action accepts a GUID. So you need to use the HTTP trigger to go find the hub site GUID to add it in.
Right.
So anyway, that was a little more than how to get started.
Another cool thing you can do with Power Automate, which we won't go into any real detail on, is you can create child flows. So in other words, you can be very modular about how you build stuff. Eric and I have done this a couple of times where you sort of have a child flow that does some really heavy lifting, but you want to call it from a bunch of different places. So you can encapsulate your logic in separate flows and build a sort of network of flows, which is pretty spiffy. That wasn't something that you could really do with SharePoint Designer workflow.
That very correct.
And we have Mike Goronin on this one, but he's not here. So I can talk about Power BI if you want, or someone else can. All right, I'll do it. So you've got Power Apps to sort of collect and manage your data. You've got Power Automate to apply some business process, some notifications, some approval, that sort of thing on top of that data. And then Power BI is really your tool to analyze, well, what does all of that data mean? So, taking the customer feedback example, we've been getting customer feedback for the last 5 years. What have our big problems been? Well, it's a lot easier if you've got a dashboard built in Power BI that shows you sort of what the trends are. And you see in the screenshots on the slide, you can build some really nice visuals around the data that is collected or used in a process, or more likely a set of processes. So it's not necessarily just like, what is this one Power App collecting on this machine on the plant floor, but maybe sort of looking at a more systemic view of what's going on that plant floor. Some of it's data collected from Power Apps, some of it might be coming from individual machines and logged into some sort of Azure storage, whatever. And then you can overlay Power BI on top of all of that data and do some analysis and dashboarding that sort of gives you the overall view of what's happening and how you're doing against the metrics that you want to
Yeah,
be tracking
again,
against.
this is where the connectors become super powerful, because you can have more than one connector for one Power BI dashboard. So you can really be pulling data in for a whole bunch of different sources, combining it together, analyzing it across function, and then visualizing that data. So it's super powerful tool. The licensing, again, so complicated. I still don't think I get it at all, but being able to share those dashboards out with the people that need that information can be really helpful. I mean, really help your business, right?
Especially when you can embed them right there in those SharePoint pages, especially when you have them on a communication site.
Exactly, and that's where the licensing eludes me. But yeah.
I think the licensing is confusing, and every time we talk to Microsoft about that, they say no, it isn't. Here's the quick example, and then of course you come up with an exception immediately, and then the conversation gets derailed. The worst part is some of it is metered. So a lot of people are worried that if they start doing something, they'll get a big bill, and that's part of the confusion. And I think there are cases where that happens. It doesn't usually happen, but you can put yourself into one of those situations. You certainly want to know about it before it happens. All right, we got to keep moving because we're going to run out of time, as always. The idea here is, the Power Platform apps and services really are meant to be used together. When we build solutions, we usually will have at least two of those different Power Platform applications somewhere in them. You've got Power App and Flow, or you've got a Power App and Power BI. The key is to really understand how to
connect them in a way that works well.
Well done, Em. Well
Thank
done.
you. So
Wow.
our
Nice.
example here, right? We're collecting our information through. Oh, he's back.
You can go.
Okay, collecting our information through Power Apps. Then you're processing that information through Power Automate and analyzing in Power BI. This one is an example around customer feedback process that Mark was talking about. But to his point, even at Simpraxis, we have a SharePoint list for our sales and for having inbound leads. And we use Power Automate to remind us when to follow up. And we use Power BI dashboard to look at our resource allocation. So to varying across the different scales of the company, right? Even small companies of 6 people can find uses for this, and large scale companies can make really robust solutions. Lessons we've learned.
What have we learned, everyone?
One of us must have learned something.
So I don't know if I've got a slide about it, but as the lone
Todd didn't learn anything.
I did. Well, probably not. But as the lone IT pro in all of this, like, this isn't really my area, but I do get a lot of people asking about admin pieces of this. So I've got bad news and less bad news. The bad news is when these products were developed, they were absolutely developed with the end user in mind and the functionality in mind and all of that. So the tools around building things are fairly rich, and the experience to varying degrees is pretty good because that's where all the focus was. There was no thought given to administration at all. So things like how do you control who in your environment can use it, and how do you control where they can get in, and how do you discover ones that are out there? That was just not anything that they thought about when they put this together. So that's the bad news. The less bad news is there are some poorly crafted PowerShell modules from Microsoft for this platform that you can sort of use to cobble this together. And they really followed no best practices whatsoever in any of this. And so there is a module for end users to use, because your end users always want to use PowerShell to work with Power Automate.
Of course they do.
And then there's an admin module for administrators, and they have lovingly added some of the same command names in those two modules that work differently. So you have to install them in a very prescribed order and do things. But once you get all of that figured out, that's kind of to wean out the weaklings. But if you get to the end and get it all installed, then you can sort of figure these things out. You can say, show me all the flows in my environment that Mark owns so that I can assign them to Derek, or show me all the flows that use a specific connector, because now it's going to start costing money and we need to figure out where that's going. That stuff is out there. Allocate a lot of time. That's not a PowerShell script you're going to whip together in 15 or 20 minutes, but it probably is out there. That's what I've learned.
I think one that I've found a lot with our clients that we work with is really starting at the beginning, making sure that you're focusing on those outcome objectives and the user stories, not just implementing a tool because that's something that's new and available to us. There's a lot of pre-work that needs to be done with any of these solutions, where you really need to be thinking about creating that user experience so they can help accomplish whatever those top tasks are and what that back-end structure is. So if you're newer to Power BI or really anything on the Power Platform, if you have a messy list that you're working from, it's just going to be an absolute nightmare as you're trying to make all of those connections.
Yeah, I think for me, the data model that sits underneath all of this is almost the most important thing, and it's not part of the Power Platform per se. You're going to store data somewhere or in multiple places, and thinking through how that data is structured is really a key component to success for any of these things. If you're good at building data constructs, taking an iterative approach isn't so horrible. But if you're not really good at thinking about, well, what data do we need to do the reporting at the end of this process? Then you're going to build a Power App that doesn't collect the right stuff. Your flow will send notifications to people that doesn't have the right data, and your Power BI dashboard may not be able to reflect the metrics that you want. So that whole spectrum is really, really important. So
I love that I was taken literally here.
Team marketing talked about it and they said it was okay.
Got it. All right. So we'll let people read between the lines of the last one, because that was mine. Follow up the owner, right? Follow up with the owner. Yeah. So that one was mine, and it was more around the idea that so you can trick the licensing gods with the owner of the Power Automate or the Power App, but all the point being is that the connectors are used what's called delegated permissions, which means that whoever the connector was created by, whatever user that was, is the rights of that connector. So if you are saying get access to this list, the user that made the connector to go to that list is the user that has the permissions for that list. Now that sounds bad, but you can also create sort of this elevated permissions sort of guideline. And so by maybe, depending on your solution that you're trying to build, by maybe creating a separate licensed user that is kind of like your solution user that can be the one with the elevated permissions to do the things that you want to do, that might make good sense in certain cases. Just be cautious with using yourself as the user, because if you are no longer there, or if you move jobs or whatever, somebody has to remember to go back and transfer that ownership of those connectors to other users. Now, granted, you can give a group of users ownership to these things, but it's still, the connector is still tied to the person who created the connector.
And
So-
changing the connectors works differently in each one of these components too. And
Yep.
some it's easier than others.
Yeah.
Sometimes
so
you actually have to run PowerShell, which is a little silly.
yeah. So you got to be a little
You
thoughtful
Get
about what
to run PowerShell. You said it wrong.
I
All
think
right,
I
well,
think
we-
the one other thing on this slide that I think is important to mention, and Derek, you've said this to me repeatedly over the last year or so, and I think it's really important, is to separate your logic. Like if you're going to have a lot of data manipulation logic, decide whether it's in your Power App or your flow. Don't try to split it just because it feels nicer to put it in one place or the other, because then you're going to build a bigger spaghetti pile than you really need. So, for example, if you build most of your business logic into the Power App and then you use the flows, a set of flows to do notifications, that's a good break. If you try to build a lot of your business logic in the Power App and into the flow, you're going to have a tougher time managing things.
Yeah, agreed.
All right.
And with that, it is the top of the hour.
It is. So here's some resources that we've collected that should help you get started if you really need some sort of leg up on how to use some of these tools. Some of them are video, some of them are, for some reason, the Power Platform world loves video. Most of the people who are big in this space generate video content, not a lot of written stuff, which I know some of us are less enamored with. But there's a lot out there if you like video. Next time we get together, we're going to be talking about the SharePoint app bar, because it's going to show up by then, right?
We
In
hope.
2 weeks. We hope it's going to be there. So it's we'll be talking about the SharePoint app bar itself, but also, how do you prepare for it? How do you think about it? How should you talk to your organization about what the app bar is all about? How does it fit into Teams? All of those things. So I think we're out of time. Do we have any questions in the
Nope,
chat
we
that
had-
we needed to cover?
Oh, anyone have experience with the PL 900 certification?
I did the
even heard
PL
that.
899, but I could never get to the 900.
I'm waiting for 901. I don't think 900 is going to be.
Oh my God, the dad jokes.
Yeah.
Certification.
Sorry, Melissa.
so-
Happy 70.
Yeah, actually, I do know someone that did take it. I have not personally. It's well-rounded. It's a well-rounded exam. I mean, these exams are hard to begin with. But if you do adequate preparation, you should be able to pass it.
Cool.
Okay.
All right.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us.
Bye,
And we
everybody.
will
See you,
hopefully
see you in a couple
weeks.
weeks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.